Okay, let's make a start. It's 2 o'clock on my clock, so we'll make a start. So welcome and thank you everybody for joining us today. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so looking at Belbin Team Roles, looking at the practical side, but also we're going to be starting at the theory. Where did these team roles come from? What is the research behind them and why do people use them? Before I do that, I just need to introduce myself. My name is Jo Keeler. I am managing partner here at Belbin and have been working with Meredith, Nigel and the rest of the team now for over 19 years. So I've been around for a while. We also have with us today Lisa Ward. Lisa has been with us for around 5 years and is that wonderful person who talks you through everything that you need to know at the end of the phone. So she's here and she will be answering all of your questions, or at least fielding them at the end. Because we have quite a few people attending, unfortunately we can't make it that interactive, so we would ask people to write their questions in the Q&A box and Lisa will go through them, and at the end of the session hopefully we'll have a few minutes and we will be able to go through all of those. Even if we don't get to answer your particular question, we will take a note and we will ensure that we get an answer to you. So without further ado, let's start. Now, before we do start, actually, I've never used this before in Zoom, so please bear with me. I've got a poll that I'm now about to put in front of you. So I'd love you to answer. First of all, are you familiar with the theory of Belbin Team Roles? I'm guessing you're kind of familiar, otherwise you wouldn't be here, but I thought I should ask anyway. And have you used Belbin Team Roles within your organisation? And by used, I don't mean just talked through them, but actually used the reports and the outputs to help individuals, managers, teams and organisations to be more effective. Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm going to click this end polling here. So the majority of you have heard of Belbin, so that is wonderful. But that goes down a little bit when it comes to actually using the tool. And I think this is quite common in my experience. Anyway, people have heard about it, they know it's quite useful, but that's about it. And they really need some advice on how to take it to that next step. So hopefully we'll be able to give you some advice today. But what we're really going to be looking at is concentrating on that research, where these team roles came from. So I'm going to end this now. Get me with my technical expertise and I'm going to share my screen. Let's start at the very beginning, because apparently, according to a song, it's a very good place to start. So we're going to start at Henley Management College. Why are we starting there? Well, we're starting at Henley Management College because it's where it all began. Henley is in the UK and it's actually the oldest management college in Europe. And they work a lot with managers, and they were also the first management college to really look at syndicate working, putting managers together for learning to see whether or not they were able to learn more effectively working together as opposed to being lectured to. So this is where a lot of the research happened. It's a beautiful place. I've been there myself with Meredith Belbin a few times. To be perfectly honest, I've got no idea how anybody gets any work done whilst they're there, because it's right on the River Thames and it is beautiful. Now, I need to introduce two people to you at this stage. I love this photo. I just quickly asked Nigel if I had permission to use it, and he said yes. These are the two main contributors. We have Dr. Meredith Belbin there, obviously on the left, and his wife, Dr. Eunice Belbin, OBE. It was never a sore point at all, I'll tell you honestly. So Dr. Meredith Belbin, Dr. Eunice Belbin, they both met at Cambridge University. They met there and they were married soon afterwards. They both had an absolute interest in people. They loved observing people and understanding why they did the things that they did, to be able to help them, to be able to predict performance, to be able to ensure that their working lives could be as effective as possible. Now, Eunice Belbin, she died about 15 years ago. She was probably the most scarily efficient and intelligent person I have ever met. She was fabulous, and she studied anthropology at Girton College. We then have Meredith Belbin, and he went to Cambridge. He studied at Clare College. He started reading the classics, but then found that actually he was more interested in people. So he swapped to psychology. So between them, they have a lot of interest and curious minds about the way that we work together. So they founded the Industrial Training Research Unit in Cambridge. In fact, Eunice Belbin was the head, she was the boss, she was the one in charge. And what they were asked to do was look at different ways that we learn, different ways we train. And they were seen very much as an academic research body to help people in the workplace. And this is why Henley approached them. This is why Henley decided, actually, we need to understand more about this syndicate work that we're putting forward, the syndicate work that we are doing here. Their syndicates contained about 10 to 11 members, and they were selected so that people had a good range of backgrounds, a good range of experiences. But they found that when these syndicates worked together, some worked better than others. And this caused a lot of debate. You know, why is that? Why were they finding that some of these really impressive and able managers who were on their courses, when suddenly they were put together with others, would do quite badly? Whereas those less impressive managers, when they worked with others, they functioned really well. They were unable to find what that missing link was, and they were unable to forecast which syndicates would do well. They didn't have enough data. What they did is they had a 10-week course, and on that 10-week course, I suppose it was like a precursor of the MBAs of today. It was for people who were already managers, who were earmarked for the higher echelons of management. And at the beginning of that 10-week course, they had a 1-week executive management exercise. And this was a simulation to be able to work out which teams, how teams work together, how do management teams interact. And what they did is they actually made those groups, now known as companies, a lot smaller. They had 6 as opposed to 10 to 11 people. But again, they found that some functioned better than others. Some were more successful than others, and they still had no clue as to why this was. But this time it was a difference because they had a measurable outcome. They had something they could judge things against. And this was because it was a competitive exercise. There was money to be counted at the end of the week. There were winners and there were losers. So this is what they went to the Industrial Training Research Unit in Cambridge with. They said, right, we have got this game, we've got these companies, and we want you to help us understand why some teams are really successful and why some teams aren't. They wanted to know, was there a link between the output, the success of the team, and the input, the composite members of the team? And it was this link that this group really focused upon. So what did they need at this stage? Well, they knew what the outcome was, but they needed to know a lot more about the input. Remember, the Industrial Training Research Unit was put together with people who have a thirst for knowledge. They really are curious and they want to know things, but most importantly, they're academic. This wasn't for any commercial game. It was because they were interested. They wanted to know more. They were fascinated about it. So what were those inputs? How could they measure? What measurements did they use? They used a whole range. Everybody who attended this course within Henley was asked, if they wouldn't mind awfully, to complete all of these tests. Some did actually refuse, and it was quite interesting. They found those people didn't actually contribute as well as to those who didn't. That's just as a by the by. So first of all, they wanted to know the personality of the people who were on this course. So they used Cattell's 16PF, the 16 personality factors. They also wanted to understand people's constructs. They wanted to understand how they saw the world, what did they value. And for this, they used the personal preference questionnaire. Now, this is an interesting questionnaire. It's not commonly known. And it's where you are asked to choose between 2 people and say who you prefer and why. And there are 50 such couples. Of course, nobody's interested in who you prefer, but they're interested to know why you prefer them. What is it that you value? What is it that you hold dear? Are you somebody who values originality? Are you somebody who wants to feel that they're more part of a tribe? They're like me. So they found a lot about people using this personal preference questionnaire. They also wanted to find out a level of intellect, so they used the Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking Appraisal, the CTA, and this is a way of finding out the intellect of the members of the people attending this course. Now, a lot of the research was done using the course that Henley had put together when it was a whole week. But what we also did, what the Industrial Training Research Unit did, was they also devised a new course called Teamopoly. Now, Teamopoly was a bit more realistic. There are far more variants involved. It was also a lot shorter a course. And they found that Teamopoly, they looked at both these different exercises, the management exercise and Teamopoly, and they pulled all of their information. And it was crucial that they did, because they got different perspectives. They also used something called Bayes analysis, and this was really crucial. When these exercises were taking place, people were asked to observe every half minute, every 30 seconds about what was going on. They wanted to find out who was doing the talking, but also the nature of the talking as well. Were people asking? Were they informing, proposing, opposing? Were they delegating? Was it more of a building communication, or were they commentating? What they could, of course, then find out is, was there a correlation between any of these informing and proposing? Is there any correlation perhaps with some of the personality factors, the level of intellect, and the success of the team? They had all of this data to be able to work out what is it that made teams successful. Now, what did they do to start with? As I think, as most of us would have done in this situation, we'd have thought, right, I know what makes the most successful teams. It's all those people who are really bright. It's all the ones with a high intellect who are scoring high on the Watson-Glaser critical thinking appraisal. We think if we put all of those together, after all, they've got the brains, that those teams would be most successful. And so they were allowed to put together teams of those who had really high scores in the Watson-Glaser critical thinking appraisal. What they weren't allowed to do was put together teams which had nobody with high intellect, as that was deemed quite rightly to be unfair. But they had to have at least one person of high intellect into each group, but there was at least one group who were just full of these brain boxes. And a lot of people said, well, this is unfair because it was quite obvious to the rest of them what had gone on. People tend to know who the ones are with the high intellect. And also they put them in a room. It was called Room A. It used to be used for Syndicate A. And they decided to make it a bit more personal. So they called this room the Apollo Room, due to the fact that NASA had obviously just made such progress in that area at the time. It was very topical. So those people were going into the Apollo Room, and people could actually say, well, hang on a second, this isn't fair. That level of unfairness didn't last long, however, because what they did find were those Apollo teams didn't do very well at all. In fact, they did worse than average. And at this point, we all had that, oh, thank goodness for that moment, don't we? Why is that? It's because they spent too much in aborted debate. They tried to, they knew the answer actually, and they weren't listening to anybody else. And they spent all their time trying to convince others that they were right. They had the best, well-stated point of view. This debate obviously was therefore quite destructive. It won't work, yes it will, and there are difficulties when decisions needed to be made. What they found was a lack of coherent teamwork nullified any gain that they may have had with a very high intellect. And if you think again from the Bayes analysis, that checking what was happening every 30 seconds, what they did find that there were very high levels of just the proposing and opposing. So people saying, I think this is a good idea. No, it's not. And this went on, and they found that these teams really did not work well. So back to the drawing board. It isn't intellect that makes for a high-performing team. Phew. So they thought, right, okay, what we'll do now is we'll put together people who are similar in their personalities. They have similar traits. And they looked at different personalities, and they looked at just two factors. They looked at introversion and extroversion, and also stability, whether or not people were had that stability that went with it. And here they had four separate groups there. They put the stable extroverts together, the anxious extroverts together, stable introverts, and the anxious introverts. They said surely people who are similar to one another, they would work well. And at first people said, this is very contrived, isn't it? Does this actually work in real true life? And they said, well, actually sometimes it does, because people like them, and we do tend to form naturally with people who have similar personalities. But was there anything to be had in this? Actually, there wasn't. They did find that the extroverts fared better on average than the introverts. But the stable extroverts were just there. They enjoyed themselves. They were chatty. They were laughing. They had lots of sense of togetherness. But actually, they just didn't see the areas. They didn't see the detail. They were quite happy just to go along with things. The anxious extroverts did really well in times of crisis, when they needed to think on their feet and when that entrepreneurial ability needed to come through. But otherwise, my goodness, very unreliable together. The stable introverts, they did well. They planned well. They had great organisation, but they lacked any sense of energy. They were quite slow moving. So they did okay, but they didn't do brilliantly. What they found with the anxious introverts is they just didn't, lots of talent there, but they didn't actually work together as a team. There's a real lack of cohesion. So their results were usually quite poor. So again, I mean, this went over 9 years, over 200 teams were analysed and looked at, but they went back to the drawing board. It's not anything to do with high intellect, and it's not anything to do with similar personalities. What is it? So they raised the question, could they identify a team member who was common to all of the successful teams? If they could identify this crucial team member, then they could analyse, they could look back and find out more about them and see whether or not that would help them in the next step of their research. Well, what they found actually was what we call implementer behaviour. They did find that in all successful teams, there were people who were very disciplined, had an affinity towards getting work done in an organised fashion. They were very conscientious. They had a real awareness of what was required of them at that sort of external obligation. They had a well-developed sense of self. They knew themselves well. They were quite practical, trusting, they were tolerant of others. They were conservative with a little c, in a sense of they respected tradition. They respected what was already done and already out there, and the way of looking at things. And they also did things because they needed to be done for the company. They weren't there for any personal gain. So these are the ones that tick things off the to-do list because the company needs them to be done rather than because they find them enjoyable. So they had real strengths, and they found, my goodness, there were people with these behaviours in every one of those successful teams, the teams that did really well. Of course, there were some downsides, and what they found as each of these roles developed, that if you're going to have strengths, there's also allowable weaknesses as well. There's a flip side, isn't there? A flip side to the strength. There's a flip side to being really good at something. And what they found with the implementers, they could be quite inflexible, slow to respond to new ideas and possibilities. They also lacked creativity. So when they put all implementer teams together, and they put teams together just comprising these people, they did okay. Well, not these people, these behaviours, I should say. They did okay, but actually, they didn't when there was a problem, when they needed an injection of an idea to come in. Okay. So what did they do? They then thought, well, hang on a second. What we really need at this point is that we need to be able to find and identify and locate those people with creativity, because this is what's really lacking here. We need to be able to see where that creativity has come from. So they went back to the data. And this is where all this data came in. This is where having the analytical minds really helped. They went back to the data and they said, right, how can we find out who the creative ones are? And they said, well, why don't we look at the people who were always proposing the ideas when it came into the group work? Surely they were the ones that were going to be the ideas people. They found that wasn't necessarily the case, however. They found it wasn't necessarily the more ideas, the more proposing meant to it more creativity. It didn't. Quite interestingly, they found when everybody was trying to be creative, what happened was that those good ideas really got lost, actually. There was too many ideas to work from. And they found it wasn't the volume ideas that was important, it was the quality of the ideas that was crucial. So instead of just looking at the amount of proposing that was done, they looked back to when they were observing when breakthrough moments happened, those aha moments, those light bulb moments. When were they happening, and could they analyse and find out who was responsible for those? And they did. They found that the people who are coming up with those aha moments tended to be ones with quite high intellect. So they're scoring high on the critical thinking analysis. There were also ones who scored quite highly in other factors, and they thought, wow, we've got this here, we've found something new, only to find out that what they had identified is that Cattell had already identified in his work previously as a formula for creative disposition. So they found those individuals who had this, and they called those behaviours that of plant behaviours. The ones who were coming in, they had a high IQ, a high level of mental ability, and they were able to come up with great ideas when needed. What they did find is these good ideas weren't always well received, and I think this is quite an interesting one, is that if they also weren't well received if there was too many of them. What they did at that point is they put lots of plants together. They thought, right, if we put more than one plant in each team, is that going to help us at all? And they found it didn't. It really was they needed to limit it to one plant per team because it just didn't work. In fact, what they found that the most creative companies were those not with most plants, but the ones that were able to take advantage of the ideas. It wasn't the plants themselves that made those teams creative. It was whether or not they also had people to take advantage of those ideas. So we have those plants come in there, those allowable weaknesses. Sometimes there's too much going on here. They've got no idea what's going on around them. Too preoccupied sometimes to be able to communicate. Now, throughout this research, it was interesting because people were saying, well, actually, some of these ideas are coming from other quarters. They're coming from people that you haven't identified as plants. So I said, okay, let's have a look at them. So they found the people who were also giving ideas and thought, well, hang on a minute, have we gone wrong here? Have we measured something incorrectly? They were really puzzled because they really were seen as creative, but they weren't hitting things on the test. They didn't have an outstanding intellect. They didn't have this fitting for this creative element. But what they did find is that the plants were seen as very introverted. This new ideas generator that they came with actually was very extroverted. Instead of having very high intellect, they had quite average intellect. They also, however, were very sociable. They were very enterprising. They had enthusiasm and they had low anxiety. They were inquisitive, stable extroverts, and they loved working with other people. And so this is where the other creative role, that of a resource investigator, came from. Whilst the plant's quite happy to sit by themselves and just sit in their head coming up with different ideas, the resource investigator went out of the team. They saw what other people doing. They brought in external influences, external ideas. They left no stone unturned, and they found treasure in unexpected spots. Now, sometimes these resource investigators were too optimistic. They got bored ever so easily, but that was okay. They'd done what they needed to do. They delivered their idea, their creativity to the team. So let's have a recap here. What is it that makes a really successful team? Well, it's not just people of high intellect. It's not like-minded people being together. It's not just the really practical ones who are able to produce very high levels of work. And it's also not just people with ideas. We needed something else there. So what they wanted to find out was, actually, does the leader, the person who is leading the team leader, have any effect on the success of the teams? So what they did, because there was somebody in the chair role of each of these teams, and they said, let's have a look at those characteristics of the ones who had the successful teams. We'll look at the characteristics of the person in the chair with the middling teams and the characteristics of the person in the chair of those teams that really weren't performing. And let's see what we can make of it. Is there anything that's coming up? And they actually thought it was going to be quite simple, but this next team role was actually quite difficult to find because it wasn't actually obvious. They thought it would be far more obvious as to who was playing that role and what they were bringing to the team when it came to the successful companies. What did they find? They found that actually it wasn't somebody with high intellect. It also wasn't somebody with low intellect. They found that the high intellect and the low intellect over and above and below and beyond were actually really not effective at all. They found the most effective person in the chair was somebody who had above average intellect, above average for the team that they were leading. They also found the same with their creativity. They couldn't be any more creative than the average or any less. There needed to be a similarity. They tended to be quite a trusting nature, and they're quite dominant, and they had quite a strong and moral commitment to achieving goals. I love this bit. They were calm and unflappable. They didn't faff. They didn't go, oh, we need to get things done. They're very calm in moments of crisis. They had that practical realism about them. And they had a great deal of self-discipline. And of course, they were very sociable. They were extroverts. They were sort of enthusiastic. They did that to motivate others. But in a more social element, they're actually sometimes quite reserved. And they found that the people who were performing well in this role really did have an effect on the outcome of the team. Were the team going to be that successful? But they found it quite curious because it wasn't obvious who these people were. In fact, when they identified them at Henley, and I find this quite interesting, they thought, really? These people weren't kind of really dominant. They weren't shouting. They weren't really visible. So they made some inquiries, actually. They sort of asked back at the organisations that they came from, and they said, how effective is this person in a management situation? And they found out they were very, very, very effective. So they had validation for that. Now, sometimes with this coordinator role, which was one of those team leader roles, they did find that they sometimes may delegate a little bit too well. You wonder what they're up to. And they can also be seen sometimes as a bit manipulative. But this was the puzzle. This was the puzzle. They thought they had identified the team leader, but in fact, had they? Because they found that of the people who were attending these courses at Henley, is the ones that they knew were very successful managers in their own right in their organisations. They weren't fitting this mould. They had a whole cohort of people who were successful, but they would not have a high coordinator. They thought, what on earth is going on here? And they found, actually, let's look at these people. What is it that these people have in common, and what are they bringing to the team? And they found that these people were very extroverted, but they had this nervous energy, a sense of achievement. They went back to the data and they noticed that when these teams were in, during their exercises, they're the ones who challenged, they argued, and they disagreed. They drove actions. They tended to be their own actions, but they drove them. They also had high resilience. They also annoyed people. They could annoy the rest of the team quite a lot, but they often recovered with good humour and kept people with them. To them, winning was the name of the game. They were looking at being very, very competitive. And of course, what I've just described there is that of the shape of behaviour, the tough, anxious extroverts, the ones that were galvanizing the team into action. They were bringing the energy required, and my goodness, complacency or inaction does not happen on their watch. Put them together, really not advised to put them together. You have all that competitiveness, and what happens is blood on the walls, a shockery of shapers, as somebody else has said. Of course, you would have people together competing against each other as opposed to working out what is best for the team. So you wouldn't have more than one shape of behaviour within a team. So which manager would you want? Would you want that high shaper manager or the high coordinator manager? Well, actually, it depends, doesn't it? And so much has happened since then. And we talk about situational leadership and knowing when it's best to play which role, depending on the circumstances around us. And the shaper was very much needed when that complacency came in. The coordinator was more at that facilitative stage to be able to listen to others, to be able to get consensus of opinion. Okay, let's recap. We've got what was seen as a traditional, the dominant roles, that of shaper and the coordinator. We have the roles which are there for creativity, the resource investigator and the plant, and we also have the implementer, the hard worker. Surely that's good enough. Do you need anything else? Well, what they found actually was when they were analysing these really, really successful teams, they thought, well, who is it that's making the decisions? Who is it who's deciding that that idea was a good one, that we need to go forward with that? And they found in the most successful teams, that decision-making process was not being given, to the person who was managing, the one who was chairing. They found it actually went to another individual, and that individual was recognised as the monitor evaluator. Again, they had a high level of mental ability combined with a disinterested detachment. They were able to take all of the emotion out of the decision making, and they were absolutely critical when those crunch decisions were needed, when they needed to know which way to go forward. They weren't necessarily that visible before then, but the contribution they made at that time was absolutely crucial. They took pride in never being wrong, but they never tried to take credit for anything. They didn't try to take credit for the ideas in the first place. What was quite interesting here is that it was needed for the monitor evaluators to have a high intellect, because they needed somebody to stand up to the plant sometimes. You needed somebody who was able to say no because A, B, and C, and somebody that the plant would respect on the intellect level. Sometimes if you didn't have somebody who could challenge the plan, any old idea went through. People were a bit scared to challenge it sometimes, but not the monitor evaluator. They're the ones who are able to ensure that the right decisions were made. And it became quite clear that it should be the monitor evaluator, not the team leader, should be the arbiter of decision making. This is where the decision making needed to be. But as my children would say, are we nearly there yet? Well, not quite. We have a few other behaviours that also really showed how important they were for teams to be successful. What they found in a lot of these teams was that there was a potential for some people to be frozen out. There was a potential for people not to be listened to, and for friction to happen in the team, especially if you had more than one high shaper behaviour, a lot of that competitive element coming in. However, somebody came forward to save the day. There was somebody who really, they knew when to time their intervention, and they were able to ensure that potential friction was calmed over, was smoothed over. They're able to make sure that everybody had a platform at the team. They were able to make their thoughts, their views heard by everybody else. They were great at listening to others. They had great empathy. The teamwork, you can see, really is perceptive. They're diplomatic. What they do is they place group objectives over their own. They don't do anything for personal glory, which is quite similar to the implementer there. They do it for the best of others. They're not there to win any trophies. Also very sociable, but with low dominance. So they were interested in people, but they didn't want to be the dominant person there. They had an interest in people. And from personal experience here, I will say with the team worker is sometimes you don't realise they're there until they go on holiday and everything just goes to pieces. They're the oil that keep the team together. So what else was needed? They went back to the data, and they found actually that some really successful teams that looked on paper that they would do incredibly well didn't. They weren't that successful, and they wondered why was that. So again, they went back and they thought, the most successful teams had somebody who had an attention to detail. And if you didn't have that attention to detail, it was very often that these teams would fall at the final hurdle. Everything would be great until that final proof, that final check. And if nobody really cares or values that, that is when the team really didn't do as well as it should. Attention to detail isn't a trivial matter. It's something that really is an asset within any team and plays a really crucial part. And this is where the role of the completer finisher really came in. Quite interestingly, anybody who works with a completer finisher will know this, is that although they have finisher in their name, they really don't like to finish, because actually things can always be that little bit better. Things can always be polished and refined. There is never an end point, which is why you need to have a good manager to be able to take work away from them. They do have this internal anxiety, and this is a good thing, because without that anxiety, they wouldn't care. They wouldn't care that things were correct and that those standards were being met. Of course, they don't like to delegate, because who's going to do as good a job as them? Very few people. So what we have there is the completer finisher behaviour, which was absolutely critical in getting those teams over that finish line to actually make them really successful. So that's it, isn't it? That's those 8 team roles that were found at Henley, for like a newsreader. Well, no, actually it wasn't. Throughout this exercise, they were constantly going back into industry. They found Apollo teams in R&D companies. They looked at the differences between the coordinators and the shapers and looked at the impact that they were having. So all of the time, the work and the learning that they were finding, they were putting back and finding out even more and validating what it is they'd found out, because they were very conscious that this could just be an academic exercise. So at each stage, they were trying out their hypothesis again, but within real life. And what they did find is, when they were doing this, that this 9th behaviour came along, and it wasn't needed at Henley, because there wasn't a role for somebody who had a real love of learning, who wanted to understand the depth of a particular subject area. These people really came to the fore when they took their work out. And this is where the specialist comes in. Personally, I'm not that keen on the word specialist, because it does imply a job title, where in fact it's not necessarily meaning that. This is a behaviour. It is somebody who loves learning. The people who sometimes don't have a job, they have hobbies that they happen to get paid for, because they have such joy and fulfillment in the area that they have chosen. Because of this, they tend to, I find, have lots of letters after their name, because they have really professional, high standards. They're the ones who want to find out more about something. They don't do bullet points. However, they can just contribute just on quite a narrow front sometimes, so you need the rest of the team to ensure that they are getting the benefit of their depth of knowledge. But there we have it. We have those 9 team roles, those 9 behaviours that over a period of 9 years were identified and found through all of the work at Henley Business School. Now, at the end of the 9 years, they wanted to do more. They wanted to keep trialling it again and again, but there's only so long you can keep with a management college and allow them to use your delegates as guinea pigs in that way. So 9 years was enough. It was a long enough time. And so what they actually did, they were invited to Australia, and they did 3 tours of Australia where they repeated a lot of this, and with same results. Which is interesting, because it showed it wasn't the culture which was critical for those teams being successful. It was the elements within that team really was showing the success. So to answer the question that Henley proposed, what is it that makes some teams work better than others? Well, actually, what we need is all of those 9 team roles, where they all need to be represented at some point within the team. And do you know something? People need to know their own strengths, and they need to know the strengths of others to ensure that they are contributing at the right time. They found that relationships that were formed, which were able to really strengthen those strengths and minimise those weaknesses, also had a real knock-on effect to the success of the team. But it wasn't as simple as saying, right, we've got all 9 team roles here, thank you very much, we'll be successful now, won't we? No. It's not how it worked. People had to still work at this. As we all know, teamwork is difficult and it's rare, and it's because we have to constantly work at it. What they found as the features of those most successful team members within those most successful teams is that, as always in life, timing was everything. Timing is important. To know when you need to make that contribution, that team role contribution, is crucial to being effective. So not only finding out your team role strengths, but finding out when it is that you need to make them. To also be flexible. All of us have all of these team role behaviours in us to some extent, but we tend to favour 2 or 3, feel okay with 2 or 3, and really want to delegate the rest. And what we need to ensure is that we are flexible and we can interchange between those 2 or 3 roles that we can really make an impact in for the rest of the team. Alongside that, we need to have self-restraint. We don't want to step on other people's toes. Know where your strengths are, know when you need to make that contribution, know which contribution you're going to make, and then shush. I've been at homeschooling my kids for too long, I think. Shush now. Stop. Let other people make that contribution. Let other people be able to make their impact on that team. They also found that the most successful team members within a successful team, it's reality. They had a sense of reality, what is possible, and we need to be able to hit that goal. So that's all fine then, isn't it? You know what the 9 team roles are, you know what makes an effective team. We'll just go and guess which team roles we are. That all works out well. Well, actually it doesn't. There's a lot more to this, and that's what they found when they took it out into industry. It really isn't as simple as guesswork. What we really need to do is find out the behaviours that we have and what that actually means. So let's just really, well, that's what Meredith said, sorry, yeah, absolutely. We need to actually find out a bit more. We can't just put people together and just go, off you go, you're a balanced team. No, we need to work at this, but we need to really identify those behaviours first. So going back to what is it that they found, what did they find? They found that these 9 team roles, and that they were a tendency, they can be defined as a tendency to behave, contribute, and interrelate with others in a particular way. And remember, it's a tendency. This is not an absolute science. It's not saying every single time you will do this. You probably won't. You will do this the majority of the time. The key word here is also behaviour. As we were seeing, it's what behaviour, what people were interacting with, which was important. So what is behaviour? Well, we've kind of covered this, so let's not spend long on this slide whatsoever. It's your personality, 16PF. This came in and influenced your behaviour. Your mental abilities, looking at your critical thinking analysis, your values and your motivations from the PPQ, but also your experiences affected your behaviour, your experiences as a person outside and inside of work. Are you the same as you were when you first started the world of work at the age of 16, 18, whenever? I know I'm not. I've had lots of different experience from there, which is informing how I behave. We also have external influences, and my goodness, right now is an external influence we can do nothing about, and that's working from home. And it's being able to manage an organisation where half the people aren't there because we've had to furlough people. This is affecting your behaviour. This is affecting the contributions that you can make with a team. And also, as we learn the language of team roles, that role learning, what is it that's going to make me really successful here? What is it that the teams needs? This is also going to affect our behaviour. So we just need, don't we, to find out how we behave. Well, it's not as simple as that either. It's not as simple as that. It's because what they did find at Henley is the success really did depend on the level of an individual's self-awareness. Each and every one of those team roles could be a really successful manager. What was the key thing? The key thing was the level of self-awareness, understanding your strengths, understanding when to play them, but also understanding what other people value. Now, to get a real level of self-awareness, what we really do need to do is we need to find out what other people think, because this is what we're measuring here. We're measuring our behaviour, and this is the bit that's visible for all to see. So if you look down there, you've got your DNA. This is pretty much fixed. Your personality is there. It's just under the surface, but we don't go to work with our personality necessarily on our sleeve. What people are seeing and what people are interacting with is our behaviour, and that's at the top there. And that's why it's so important to get feedback from other people to find out what behaviours they are seeing, what behaviours they are valuing. It really is key to self-awareness. Otherwise, we're in an echo chamber, aren't we? We're in an echo chamber. Yes, I'm brilliant at that. Oh, yes, I am, aren't I? And you continue doing it. What you need is to have that validation from others. So once you've got all of this information as an individual, what do you do with it? Well, for you, you need to use it for self-development, for learning, for self-awareness. Learn where and when you can make your best contribution. Understand how others see you. and learn how to be a strong example of a type. Learn how to really strengthen your strengths and to manage those weaknesses, not to get rid of your weaknesses, but to manage them. How do you do that? Well, you fill in a questionnaire called the Self-Perception Inventory, and you find out how you see yourself along all of those 9 behaviours, but also that of how other people see you too. And we combine that data to give you an overview of which of those Belbin Team Role behaviours that really you should adopt. And it's important to do this. And what we've done here is everything's on a percentile score. And what does that mean? Well, do you know, it doesn't matter how high you score if everybody else in the world scores the same as you. So it's always relative to the population. So here, the population size is 9,500. We review that on a regular basis. We're now on our 7th version of Belbin, looking at all the research, constantly going back to data and checking that everything is measuring what it's purporting to measure. So as an individual, you can find out which team roles not only you see, but others too. And this is the interesting bit. This is the self-awareness, this is the development, this is the growth. This is finding out what you see in yourself compared to others. And all these pages, I've only just done a selection here, are available in those individual reports to find out more about yourself. You can also find out whether or not people are seeing those allowable weaknesses for each of those team roles, or whether or not they're seeing those strengths. Sometimes you may find those weaknesses overshadowing those strengths a bit. This is all really good feedback. And we're all unique individuals. So finding out what words people have ticked to describe you, because that's all an observer assessment is that people just have to tick words that they think apply strongly to you, to find out where those ticks were based, where people see your strengths and your contributions is crucial stuff. And as a team, you need to understand the gaps and the overlaps. Who should make the contribution and when should they make them? What are you missing? Do you need to find somebody else for the team? What have you got too many of? And are you cloning? Are you tending to recruit like-minded people for your team? We need to find out what is the team role distribution. We need to find out what are the averages and who is that individual who's going to show that team role more than anybody else? Where are those strong examples? And overall, what does the culture of your team look like? What are the strengths? Look at what are the weaknesses? And what words can that team use to describe themselves? And this is all part of the team reports. We have the individual reports. We combine all of those together to produce these team reports. And I'll tell you who these are really useful for. This is the managers. Do you know the strengths and weaknesses of everybody in your team? Do you know how to manage each person? How has that changed since everybody's been working from home? To find and to have a language that is understood by all to help you manage individually and collectively as a team, it's going to really help make managers make that transition to be outstanding people managers. So a quick recap, we've gone through a lot of the history, a lot of the theory, where these 9 team roles came from. The so what? Well, actually, if you measure yourselves using the self-perception inventory and the observers, you have got a wealth of information. They're not just about yourself and your contributions, but which your teammates, your managers, and those that you work with can use as well to be as successful as you possibly can, to be in one of those teams that was most successful in the Henley work. So there's lots of ways that you can use Belbin. And people do use Belbin worldwide. I've just got here, I think it was 150 logos before everything crashed, of companies that have used Belbin over the last 30 years. Worldwide, we have an amazing group of distributors who have translated Belbin into different languages and who are really there to help you implement Belbin wherever you are. Now, I could go on and talk about different ways organisations have used Belbin, look in a bit more detail about whether or not it's been in for individuals, teams, managers, but I think we're going to leave it there. We know that organisations have used it really well for change management, and don't worry, you'll have these slides to be able to read through. We know, oh, like that was a little clip there of an organisation that's using it as a startup. We also have huge organisations. This is a massive multinational that really wanted to see were they cloning their departments. And so they could see the averages for their manufacturing departments, their sales and marketing departments. And here we have a company in New Zealand who are able to use the criteria for success as a team and managers, and to be able to correlate that with Belbin. They sent me this lovely infographic. They could see what are those key qualities that were required for managers. They found out that those successful managers had a high degree of self-awareness. They needed the teams to be smaller than average, so on and so forth. But that's for another day. We'll have another webinar to really explain how people have used Belbin in their day-to-day work. You know, there's a reason why companies such as Alibaba and Xerox, etc., use Belbin as part of their management and leadership education. It's because we are such nuanced individuals, and the more we can find out about ourselves, the more effective we can be when we're managing others, and when we're being managed, and also when those teams are being put together. Because after all, simply putting together a number of people and expecting them to work as a team is not quite enough. We need to do a bit more than that. The language of Belbin can really help. Crikey. That was 50 minutes learning about the research and the understanding of Belbin, where it all came from and how it can be used. Now, Lisa, I believe we have quite a few questions at the moment.
Yes, we do. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for all your wonderful questions that have been flying through. I'm going to start with quite a straightforward one, Jo, if that's okay.
Of course.
Why are plants called plants?
Lovely question. Plants were called plants. Remember, they're the ones who are identified as high intellect and also high creative disposition. One was planted into each of the teams at Henley to ensure that there was enough creativity. So nothing to do with greenery, leaves or flowers. It's just that they needed one person with those attributes planted into each of the teams to ensure they were successful.
Lovely, thank you. Can you just talk very briefly, and I have said to this gentleman I will speak to him afterwards if he wants it, just about the importance of combination of roles and saying you're not one thing?
No, absolutely. I mean, what I should have also mentioned that the teams at Henley consisted of either 6 or 4 people, and yet all 9 of these team roles were identified. We can play each of these roles. We are not one thing. And of course, our behaviour changes, so what those things are can change as well. But we tend to have 2 or 3 team roles that we have strengths in, 2 or 3 where we're manageable, and 2 or 3 that we really should delegate if feasibly possible. But we are all a wonderful combination of all 9 team roles. We should never pigeonhole ourselves in just one category.
Perfect, thank you. Do certain kinds of business teams need a certain range of roles? So I guess industry, if you're perhaps dealing with a charity, to industrial perhaps.
Good question. No, all 9 team roles are required regardless of industry. What you do find is different industries place more or less importance on some of the particular team roles. And then you do find different cultures and a lot of cloning occurring, which is okay when things do well, but when things aren't doing so well, that is when they realised that actually they needed a more balance of team roles available. So all team roles are needed regardless. However, not all are equally valued, which is a shame.
You've partly answered this, but I will ask it. Can behaviours be learned? Is it possible for 1 or 2 people to work together and hold all of the roles between them?
Yes, behaviour can be learned. In fact, some of these behaviours were easier to, well, not easier, it's not difficult, easy to learn a behaviour. But for example, the coordinator role did have some attributes that could be learned. So yes, we can learn these behaviours if we understand them in full and we understand what our affinities are. What we do find is we can learn behaviour. Are we any good at it though? And this is the crucial thing, is that sometimes people learn behaviour because it isn't available elsewhere, but then suffer what we call team role strain because they're then asked to play that behaviour more than they potentially want to. Can 2 people cover most of the team roles? I'd say 2 people could cover comfortably 6. A twosome actually is good. Meredith Belbin really does rate 2 people working together, but there will be a couple of roles missing there. The best combination is 4.
Have you found there's any bias in cultural norms, as in not Western norms?
Again, that's really interesting. And this is why it's wonderful to have such a fabulous, they're listening, I have to know, fabulous range of distributors with us, because we have compared and looked at all of the data around the world. And we thought there might be nuances between different cultures, but actually not. We found that there were some differences, but there wasn't anything statistically significant. In fact, they found there was more variance within a country. So there's more variance between an oil company and a charity than there were between two countries, which is actually quite interesting. There were some differences, but not necessarily anything which was remarkable.
Perfect. A nice commercial one, actually. What do you find to be the greatest challenge in convincing business owners or managers the value of Belbin? So I guess this is good for independent consultants wanting to use Belbin.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest challenges is the fact that people have done Belbin because they've completed an old questionnaire which somebody once gave them on a training course, and they used it and they got some numbers, and I thought, well, I've done Belbin now. It's not new, it's not exciting. If any of you have actually used an old bootlegged version of Belbin, it is not Belbin. It hasn't been researched, it hasn't been validated, and it really isn't useful. So the biggest challenge is people who think they've already done Belbin when in fact they really haven't. Once people do see the proper Belbin, the proper questionnaires with the proper reports, it's less of a challenge. It really is. People just find it fascinating and they can see how they can use it. And I'd say actually that's one of the things that business owners really love about Belbin, is it's so practical and that everybody understands the language. It's something that they find they go back to time and time again. Any other questions at all? What have we got here?
Sorry, Jo.
That's okay.
I'd accidentally muted myself. I do apologise. Somebody's confused between the key differences between a shaper and coordinator.
Okay, the coordinators are very calm individuals. They don't have any internal anxiety. They're the ones that see the big picture. They're very broad in outlook, and they want to ensure that everybody is contributing. Whereas the shapers have very high levels of anxiety, and they're very challenging and they're very dynamic. So both roles can be very dominant within a team. But if you see the coordinator as more as the conductor of making sure they know what it's meant to sound like, bringing everybody in at the right time, whereas the shapers in the wings saying, come on, crack on, we all need to get something done here. That's the main difference between them.
Perfect. And I think we've only got one or two more. Again, you've possibly covered this. I will just bring it up though from David. How would Belbin be useful in a restaurant or manufacturing environment? Do you have an example?
Oh, crikey, we have examples in both the restaurant and manufacturing environment. I'll send them to you, David, because they're not my anecdotes to give, but I think we've got one or two that have been published in magazines. Interestingly, in restaurants, a lady called Helen Bennett, who did a lot of work on Belbin, she used to work very much in the hospitality industry, and she used to use Belbin very much to ensure they're getting the right recruits, because she found a lot of cloning in restaurants and lots of square pegs trying to be pushed through round holes, or the other way around, isn't it? To get people to ensure that they'd be able to fit in the team. And by using the language of Belbin, they found it a lot easier to be able to describe the types of behaviour that actually were required. But we do have some stuff there. Lisa, write a note there. We'll send it to you in the case study.
Perfect. Finally, I think this is possibly the last one. Do certain kind of businesses need certain types of roles? This is quite an interesting one to do with culture, I presume.
Yeah. Do you know, it's really interesting because what we haven't talked about is other things that a team needs. A team needs to have a purpose. It needs to have an objective. It needs to be measurable. There needs to be psychological safety. There needs to be work with a reason. People need to have a sense of purpose. There's lots of other things that a team does need. One of the crucial things is working out what it is that the team needs to achieve at that time. So sometimes some roles are less important than others. You still need to know that they're there, but depending on the objective of the team, it could be that actually you don't need that creativity at that stage. So plant resource investigator behaviour, we don't want you right now. What we're really interested in is looking at the overall strategy to ensure that what we're doing longer term is going to be more effective. So different teams potentially could need different team roles at different times, depending on what the objective is that everybody is trying to achieve.
Perfect. Have we got time for one more, Jo? Are we finishing dead on 3?
Well, I'm a shaper. Well, I have high shaper behaviour, and we have 30 seconds. So if we can fit it in, let's do it. Otherwise, we will not overrun.
Okay, another, again, quite an easy one. It's saying, do you have any examples of how useful Belbin has been in a tech firm, mainly consisting of software developers? They're always good fun to work with, aren't they?
They are. We have had some great success, actually, and this was sometimes around those Apollo teams, really high intellect people working together. So we have had some useful work with sort of high-tech companies, especially as we're at Cambridge based. There's plenty of them to choose. Do you know what the key thing was? Is that insurance, that co-ordinator, the person who was ensuring that the work was being done in, with the overall strategy, was respected by everybody else within the team. That was crucial, actually, when it came to those. Again, I think we've got a case study written. I will send that to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
When I say I actually mean Lisa. I was just about to take all credit then and delegate like a true coordinator. Lisa will be doing all of the hard work. I just talk. Okay, so if that's all of those for now, I can see there's other things appearing in the chat, and I'm sure we'll be able to respond to those as well. But it's been an absolute delight. We will be in contact afterwards. For those of you who have yet to find out your Belbin team role profile, look out for the email we'll send. There will be a discount code for you to go on and find out your team role profile and actually realise, have you been making the best contribution you possibly can be? Right, thank you very much indeed. Take care, keep safe, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.
Bye.